Hi, Deborah Callahan here. Today I'll be interviewing the extraordinarily gifted April DeAngelis. April is an integrative autism specialist who provides a new roadmap for parents and professionals around the world, helping them get unstuck from crisis and come to a place of peace. Welcome, April.
Thank you for that introduction.
And I was doing a lot of thinking about this right before we hopped on here today. And as I shared with you, April, I just read these statistics that autism spectrum disorder has risen in prevalence from 1 in 5,000 in 1975 to 1 in 36 in 2016, and has been doubling every 3 or 4 years in the last decade in the US. Would you agree with those statistics?
Yeah, I would agree.
Okay, so can we start out by maybe defining the diagnosis of that and what your definition of it would be?
The research has shown there are what researchers might call core traits or core challenges associated with autism. So this is regardless of IQ or language ability. And this is why we see people that might not on the outside appear to be very affected, but they can still have significant challenges in their quality of life, having a job, living on their own, having real friends, real connections, relationships. If you want to drill it down to what the research says, there's something called experience sharing communication, which a non-autistic person uses 70 to 80% of the time. And that's just when we share about things and we're curious about what each other thinks. And we ask, what did you do this weekend? And what are you going to do when you go away on your vacation? That's experience sharing. That is something that by definition, if a person's on the spectrum, they're usually lacking completely or it's very underdeveloped. There's that piece. There's something called episodic memory. I'm not going to get into all the specifics of that, but it relates to a person being able to call on their past and learn from experiences and apply them to the present. And that's why when you look at someone, regardless of language or IQ, the things that they use to measure autism are typically things that a non-autistic person can do by the time they're 2.5 years old. So does that make sense? So the experience sharing, also self-awareness is one of the areas that they have found, and flexibility, adapting to change.
So when people come to you, at what point are they at in their journey and how do you begin to help them?
Well, historically, I was trained in multiple things. So the approaches that I'm trained in are parent-based, and I like to talk about the integration aspect in terms of, you can think of the brain, like the cortex level is language and higher level academic, and that's for relationship functioning. There are approaches that are top down and there are approaches that are bottom up. So bottom up would be the brainstem, the cerebellum, which is where reflexes and things like that. I'm trained in both. So this is not what people normally get when their child gets a diagnosis. They are sent to usually behavior modification, which is a very old framework. A new study actually came out showing that a range between 76 and 86% of kids on the spectrum that received behavior services actually did not change or got worse using this old method, because the things I'm trained in were cutting edge knowledge by innovative people that were on the frontier. They find me when their kids are 10, 11, 12, teenagers, adults. Nobody's sending 2 and 3-year-olds to these approaches because they're immediately being funneled into behavior intervention. At this stage, what I'm doing is I work privately. Typically, I have some adults I'm working with now. People that have a really high need for an integrative home program is where I'm focusing my one-on-one work. But I'm offering group training and courses for parents so I can catch that younger stage of, okay, your child just got diagnosed or you're on a waiting list. It would be great if those parents had access to this information before they go down a path of the traditional model and it's not really getting to the root. So I'm really trying to create a kind of an ecosystem that addresses different stages of the journey, but I have experience from 22 months to 40 something years of age.
Are they generally in the middle of a crisis? How do you help them get unstuck?
At this stage, I don't get so much crisis families anymore, but I did earlier on. And the first thing is that I think part of the crisis is there's so many things out there. People don't know what to do. They're trying to do it all. They're told more is better. They're told they need to do all of these things. The kids are in 5 different types of therapy and full days of ABA. And so one of the things I do is guide families to answer a series of questions to help them get clarity. Because anything, to any parents who are watching, anything that you are looking to invest in, it's because you think it's going to bring you something. So you're feeling like, if I do this therapy, or if I do this many hours, or I add more things on the pile, it's going to fix the autism or whatever the behavior is. And then I can feel XYZ, I can do XYZ. And so what I educate parents on is we can get to the root of those challenges. You can have a balanced lifestyle that supports your child. And at the same time, we're going to address the things you want to do then. We're going to do some of those things now. And so what happens is parents then have a cohesive way of, I know I'm addressing, they also feel relief, right? Because when you see that changes are happening with a different approach that's based on more recent research, then that brings relief too. But knowing that there are processes in place to use, that you're not stuck making that decision that you're thinking about and you feel like for the rest of your life it has to be that way. I teach processes to help around that. One of them is clarity questions, and another is a framework of like a 90-day process, a 90-day vision that we reevaluate.
Okay, so you and I have talked a lot about the nonverbal aspects of autism.
Yeah.
And the heart opening that's possible once people understand that a little more. Can you tell us a little more about that?
So we did have a conversation around that. And that goes back to the research showing that if someone qualifies for an autism diagnosis, that there are these developmental gaps. There's something called social referencing. And I think for anyone who knows someone on the spectrum, if you understand this, it can also alleviate a lot of your confusion around behaviors and confusion around how do you help your child with anxiety. Because what happens in typical infancy and when we are toddlers is that if we have responsive parents, the infant is sending cues and the parent is adjusting based on the infant's cues. So, you're playing a tickle game and the infant starts to turn away, they start to avert their gaze. And a responsive parent will see that as, oh, let me back up, let me slow down, let me lower my voice, let me wait a moment. Then the parent who isn't aware might do more tickling to try to get the eye contact. And then typically what happens also is there's something called productive uncertainty. So if there's a little bit of uncertainty, the baby's a little wary, they look at the parent for information. Oh, a new person is coming over to greet me. They look up at mom or dad. And from a physiological standpoint, your body is getting aroused in this sort of low level anxiety kind of state. And then mom or dad smiles and says, oh, it's okay, it's just grandma. And then the baby calms down and accepts and knows this is safe. And this just continues. And there's thousands of these experiences. And by the time they're walking, now they're into stuff. And now if they see something new, you're hoping they will look back like, do I mess with this thing that I've never seen before? Is this safe? Or that dog, whatever it is. What happens with autistic children is they are not doing that. So imagine, we get acclimated, like the up and the down and the up and down, the regulation, we stay within this sort of window. The autistic baby, the autistic child is going up, 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 up with their anxiety and arousal level, and no way to regulate it based on that dynamic of the parent-child relationship.
So could you walk us through that a little bit, the social referencing?
Yeah. So in a typical relationship or a healthy relationship with a parent and a child, babies are always getting information non-verbally. And there's a researcher named Dr. Ami Klin. He originally was out at Yale, and I think he's in Georgia now at the Marcus Autism Center. He's done a lot of research looking at infants and their eye gaze. And he found that infants that are autistic are not looking at faces. So we have to understand that autistic people might not be processing the nonverbal communication that we all use to resolve our uncertainty. And we use this all day, every day. Our body will actually learn to regulate based on the feedback we're getting from our caregivers. But if you don't have that, and this is thousands of hours of this type of experience in early childhood, if you don't have that and you're autistic, your anxiety is just going up. And there's no way to regulate that because you don't know that there's these nonverbal cues you can use. And so how do you resolve your anxiety? You become very rigid. You have to line your toys up. You have to keep people out. You have to tell your parent what to say, when to say it. You don't play well with peers because peers are very dynamic and you have to read a lot of body language and adapt and go with the flow. Well, you're not going to be flexible because you literally are trying to just survive and to feel safe. And so the when we look at traditional approaches, they're looking at behavior, but they're not helping that person actually learn to use all that information that's available to them. And there is a program that actually was developed that's done that. It's been around for 20 years. It was founded by a man named Dr. Stephen Gutstein. It's called RDI, Relationship Development Intervention.
Okay.
And so I was a consultant for 10 years. That would be one of the top-down approaches I was describing, where you're coming from the relationship and helping integrate the brain through experiences and through shared learning interactions with a parent, because that's how it happens in typical development. Does that make sense?
Yes.
As far as
yes,
because
totally.
you see how the lack of social referencing then affects other things, anxiety. And the way things work now is people are kind of piecemeal. They say, oh, he has anxiety, let's take him to go get medication or supplement, or let's teach him strategies to cope with change. And they don't really realize 50% of the anxieties probably could be resolved if the person had that ability to reference and regulate. And then you get that in place, and then you see what's left over. And so that's kind of how I work with families, is in phases of the stages in terms of development. What comes first, supporting them to actually put this into their lifestyle so that it's something that actually changes the brain and helps that person process information.
Wow, so fascinating. So I don't even know where to go next, because I'm just so like, that was brilliant, and something that I've never thought of, even as a mom.
You don't need to know these things when your child isn't having challenges. You don't need to go delve into research and figure out how the brain works, but these things have come out of the problems that are still present. And if the old method has not been working, I mean, research has been showing for decades that adults on the spectrum have a very poor quality of life. Then researchers came along and said, well, it looks like the research is doing this, so let's make a program about what's actually happening in the brain. We can only do as well as the information we have.
For someone whose child has just been diagnosed, what would be the top 3 tips?
They're finding parent-based approaches are more helpful. So I would say to any parent, the first thing is just have a little bit of relief that there are approaches now that you probably did not get the flyer for when your child got the diagnosis. Mm-hmm. And if you were told that your child, I don't hear it so much anymore, but in the early days, I did hear families who had been diagnosed in different places, and they were told things like, just put him in an institution. Like, people were still saying that. If you were told things like that, I'm telling you, disregard it. That the information that we have now, there's even people who are nonverbal, it can be very intelligent. You want to presume competence. So don't listen to everything that you were told at the initial diagnosis. If it was something that was negative about your child, or it changed the way you viewed your child, because that then you carry forward with you to all of your decisions and the expectations, for services and things. But I can share the clarity questions that I use. And I'll also talk a little bit about the 90-day process, because that affects people in terms of decisions that they make. They feel like the decision they're making now is going to last forever, and it causes all this stress that they just don't need to deal with. The first one is, so what do I not want? This might be, maybe you're going to hire a new therapist. I don't want somebody who's going to be on the cell phone when they're supposed to be with my child. I don't want somebody who's going to make my child feel bad about themselves. I don't want somebody who is going to talk about my child in front of them, which happens quite a bit, by the way, in the behavior world. There's so much unhealthy language and thinking and actions in front of kids. You don't see that in the other approaches, the relationship-based ones. So what do I not want is to get super clear relating to your child, whether it's their school, a therapist, whatever. What do I not want to feel? I don't want to feel like I didn't do everything I could for my child. I don't want to feel anxious. I don't want to feel overwhelmed. I don't want to feel scared about his future. And then there's, what do I want? So often having the don't wants helps you get clear on what you do want. I want an attentive teacher who's going to notice when my child is stressed. I want a school that does not send home homework. They don't need homework if they're not even using social referencing. Just a tip. You're just looking at kind of the opposite of what you wrote for what I don't want. Okay. What do I want to feel? I want to feel competent as a parent. I want to feel hopeful about the future. I want to feel like I can take my child on a vacation. We can just spend time together and enjoy each other's company. These questions make such a huge difference, because when you have that clarity, and then you go to a school or you go to a therapist or you're interviewing someone to work with your child, you've already fleshed out for yourself what it is you're actually looking for. And then when you progress, and this ties into the 90-day visions, you can see more clearly oh, wait a minute, we started this new program and 2 months in, he's a lot less happy than he was. And all of a sudden he's fighting himself. These are things I've seen, by the way. People, what often happens is parents just keep going and they're told by therapists, oh, it's an extinction. It's going to get better. It's going to be autoclitic, like it's just going to snap and he's going to get it one day. And people go down a route for 3 years doing something, when if they had this framework, they could say, you know what I'm seeing is different than it was before. We were better than before, and it's not matching up with what I have here on my clarity questions. So that means we need to course correct. We need to stop doing what we're doing and look at everything. What happens is the downturn happens because of how kids are being treated. They're treated like pigeons and dogs. And between stimulus and response, we have thoughts and feelings. But autistic kids, no one is talking to them as if they're a person and that they have thoughts and feelings and they're expected to perform. And then you see an increase in negative behaviors. Then they say, oh, it's warranted. We need to do more therapy because look, he's autistic. Wow. And really it's the effects of what's happening. So if parents have these frameworks, they can then see more clearly when they start to go awry instead of 2 years down the road and a lot of trauma and damage has been done. So that was the first 4 questions. The 5th question is, how do I want my child to feel? So that is a very telling question, because when we talk about measuring progress, I think it is helpful to track things like, okay, this is a person who has some self-injury or aggression, or we're tracking their language development. It's okay to monitor those things as indicators, but I think there's an issue when every single thing that you're observing is those things and the therapist isn't interacting with the child and they've got their clipboard and they're tracking how many times do they hit the floor in anger or whatever. No one says like, hey, let's track how many times this kid smiles in a day. What if we started tracking that? Energy flows where attention goes, and what you track increases. Why don't we look at that as a measure? And we know, because he was smiling and now he's not. Now he's an angry kid. It's not the autism, it's the approaches that are often being used.
So fascinating. Okay, so that's the last question. How do I want my child to feel? What is the 90-day vision?
So that is basically a process where we use the clarity questions to choose like 1 to 3 top things for the next 90 days. And so often parents that I work with, I'm a parent too. There's always background stuff. The garage needs to be decluttered, or taxes are due now, whatever these things are, they're in our mind. But at the same time, these parents who have autistic kids are also trying to help their kids. So they've got normal life stuff and they've got a child that they're really trying to do their best to figure out, what do I need to do every day to help my child? And you can't really be present with your child if you're a person who has to have the house clean before you can focus on anything. So in the top 1 to 3 projects, I will help parents focus on, okay, what's the priority for your child right now? So that's going to be one of them. Maybe for a particular family, sleep is a big priority and issue, and it's affecting everyone. So we would say, okay, in the next 90 days, our goal is we want everyone is sleeping through the night, and we have a whole plan on how would we do that and how do we support that. But then the other 2 things might be bigger picture things that long-term help the parent get out of overwhelm, declutter. And then as time goes on, more and more pieces are focusing on the child, because the parent has learned processes to keep the overwhelm out instead of it's constantly encroaching. So the first project might be we're focusing on sleep. The second one might be I'm going to declutter my kitchen and have a garage sale by 90 days, which, by the way, the child is helping with that. So in our relationship program, the child's learning like, okay, let's figure out how do we sort what we want to throw away and what we want to keep and what we're going to sell. That's thinking, problem solving. And so what happens is that along the way, kids are getting life skills because their parents are learning how to give them that second chance of what happens in early development. They're just giving them age appropriate things to do. You wouldn't do that with an infant, but you could do it with a 10-year-old, and you're just focusing on allowing them to read your nonverbals as you're doing it. Does that make sense?
Yes, totally.
And at the same time, mom's getting her kitchen organized, and then she's going to feel better. And then the third piece, it could be a health thing. If it's a mom that like wants to get to fit shape, because it can take a toll if you're stressed all the time and not eating well. Like, it just depends on the family, but we focus on 1 to 3 things depending on how big those things are, and we're tracking it. I work with people ongoing, so every week or every 2 weeks we meet, and then every 90 days we're revisiting, and sometimes we adjust it sooner because it's 2 months and they've already accomplished everything, and that's how we roll. And so if we don't have that, what can potentially happen is you have a parent, for example, who's making a decision like, oh, I think I need to homeschool my child. School's too stressful and I don't have time that I need to help them build foundations. And so I'm just worried that if I homeschool them and maybe they're in 3rd or 4th grade, they're thinking they're going to affect, can they get into college? And are they going to get a diploma? That's where they're thinking. So they're like, this is such a huge major decision. I could ruin his life. If you have a 90-day vision, every 90 days, we're checking how things are going and we can course correct. So it's the concept of course correcting rather than this is it and you're done. Now you've got this big weight on you because you're feeling like you're going to have a kid at home for 8 years more, when maybe he needs a year, 2 or 3 years of homeschooling. And then you find a great school situation. If you have that framework, it relieves a lot of that pressure and a lot of that fear and anxiety that just adds to that you just don't need to have. So these are things that I learned from the business mentoring kind of world and just adapted it for families to be able to use it in their lives and help them manage all of the things. Because there's a lot.
Yeah. But what a beautiful approach. So thank you for this incredible chat and for the work that you do. It's amazing. To wrap it up, could you talk about like how people could work with you or the resources that you provide for parents?
I have courses that are available for parents so they can get started right away. For example, communication and connecting with your child, or getting out of overwhelm. I have some free things for getting out of overwhelm. That's often a big reason people will say they're not ready yet for the academy. And they're not realizing the academy is designed to help you get out of overwhelm. So there is a group program. Integrative Autism Institute is where people can go and they can schedule a free chat to just find out kind of where they are. When I'm talking to people, I really just want to hear what their experience has been. And I'm trained in a lot of different approaches. So I also have a Facebook group where I'm sharing with parents what the research actually says, information about different ways to help the kids from bottom up and top down. When I say kids, also adults on the spectrum. The Transcend Autism Parent Facebook group is another place people can go for support and just learning and education, and to be with like-minded parents who are really trying to live a more balanced life while they help their kids progress.
Beautiful. Okay, so I have one last question for you. Do you get overwhelmed by this work?
Not by this work.
By doing life and this work at the same time.
I am in a unique situation. I think we've know each other. So I'm a single homeschooling mother. My daughter's father died when she was a baby. So like I've been overwhelmed. But I also, going through that process, I've realized, because definitely there's a grieving process with things like that. And sometimes what's happening is people are trying to medicate their grief, or they're being prescribed things when it's actually grief.
Exactly.
It's not. It's not a mental imbalance or anything like that. You have to go through it. And I'm out the other side, but I definitely had a time where I could feel like I wanted to cocoon. And also my daughter was very young and it was just me. So taking care of a baby by yourself is a lot. But I wouldn't say the work I do, the way my brain works, I just see all the moving parts at the same time. So when a parent comes in and they say, oh, they're having sleep issues, I see 5 different avenues of, okay, we're going to address it from these different things. And then I'll refer out for like more the biomedical side of things. So I don't get overwhelmed by the work, but I use these same processes in my own life for sure.
Yeah.
And I think they do help a tremendous bit.
So April and I would love to hear from you. If you know somebody who would benefit from this video, please share it, please like it, and please subscribe to my channel. Thank you, April, so much.
Thank you. This was great.